Coming up on this week's RegCast.
What is DORA trying to achieve? It's saying you should build a better ship. So it's really designing your operating model with a resiliency-centric attitude. I think this is going to create a new cultural mindset towards resiliency and towards how you manage third and fourth party risk.
But you also might not be invited to play. If you're the weak spot and everyone knows it and knows you've underinvested, there's every risk that in the connected world, people start to say, no thanks, we'll not do business with you.
You can now have AI tools that can download 22,000 paragraphs of DORA and then effectively use that to compare your existing policies and procedures to see, which ones are being flagged.
The service providers themselves are realizing, we can come in and offer a repeatable service that allows you to have advice via using some of this technology ourselves. The vendors are coming to realize what this will actually mean, as well as the firms. And I think we'll be looking at a really fun ride for the next couple of years. Hi, I'm PJ, CEO and founder of JWG, and I'm very pleased to be bringing you the third episode of season 5 of RegCast. We've been continuing to dig deep into the risk that technology presents to the system itself. And in the last couple episodes, we've really unpacked a lot of what these regulations mean as well as what they say. We're turning this ship 180 degrees from where it's been, and the relationships between the vendors and the firms and the industry groups are all going to change. We talked about kite marking and standards last time, and we want to really think about what new technologies can be of use. But today we want to pivot to what would OpRes really mean for the technology stack itself, and what muscles do we need to build? There's a lot of new things that we're being asked to do here, like business plans and strategies and oversight and controls that we ought to be able to deploy in a much better way than with the technology that we use to build all these ships over the past 40 years. So remembering that operational resilience is just one of many parts of the marathon, we want to turn to what does the technology muscle need to look like for 2025 with a couple of experts here. Why don't you introduce yourself and what you do?
Thanks, PJ, for inviting me on. So my name's Sajjad Khan. I used to be a tech COO. I've worked throughout my career for financial institutions and most recently financial market infrastructures. I'm currently freelancing as an AI transformation consultant. I think a lot of what you just introduced brings together multiple forces across the globe, whether it's what the regulators are looking at, what emerging technology is, and what's kind of the interconnectedness that we're seeing across the globe.
Thank you. Chris.
I'm Chris Owers. I am the global head of the reg compliance practice at First Derivative. We are a capital markets consultancy helping firms meet obligations across the regulatory landscape, but also change and transformation throughout.
And welcome back. You have been on a RegCast before, I think. So, okay, so without further ado, let's get to the first question, which is all about implementation strategies. What are the biggest obstacles we need to overcome during this DORA transition process, Chris?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a couple of things. We're seeing firms that, very early on started programs for DORA and have got in under the hood and are working through understanding their organization, which in the main are generally quite complex, the documenting their framework, particularly their ICT risks, and then their responses to that. So those organizations, projects are going well. We are seeing pockets where, organizations maybe didn't start as soon. DORA, I can't remember from your article, but it's X number of 1,000 pages. I'm sure you'll tell me the exact number. And it's scary on the outside. Once in, there are some reasonable steps that you can take to start seeing where you are versus the regulation, and then where you are versus your own risk tolerance. So a different mix of where firms are positioned.
So you're helping people to unpack or put together really the 22,000 paragraphs of DORA to say this is what it says, and help them interpret what it means for them.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we have a front to back capability of understanding technology within banks, and we've been helping them work through the excessive amount of literature on it, and taking tangible steps to be compliant in January.
And what are you finding to be the biggest implementation issue for these firms? Is once they know where their gaps are, what is it that's hardest for them to progress?
Yeah, so there's two real distinct areas. There's internal complexity. It's not new to be suggesting that the large institutions are a complex mesh of systems, and DORA is forcing the issue of understanding the interconnectivity, but also then how secure are each of those components, and potentially are some of the legacy systems, are they the weak spot internally, and what does the firm need to do? The second one is about third party risk, and whilst there's been regulations before about managing that, it brings it to the fore for organizations and starts to drill through into that fourth and fifth party risk. As firms start to analyze that a little bit more, they'll understand their exposure, and over time, I think the ecosystem and collective group of firms will start to see their exposure to single firms, much like obviously the CrowdStrike exposure that firms have.
Yeah, and that CrowdStrike is a great example. I guess, Sajjad, we've spoken about this in the past. It brings into focus just how complex some of this infrastructure is. What are you seeing as the big changes required for an operational resilience program?
Yeah, I mean, if you stand back and what is DORA trying to achieve? It's not saying you should prepare for a storm. It's saying you should build a bit better ship, right? So if you think about that's creating a resiliency mindset first. Mm-hmm. How do you prepare in advance, not wait until something happens and then you kind of kickstart all your kind of resiliency efforts? So it's really designing your operating model with a resiliency-centric attitude. So if you take, for example, CrowdStrike, I'm pretty much clear that even most people in technology had never heard of it. Forget people outside technology, and yet that had a massive business outage in the sense it was on the front pages of every national newspaper. People in the health service were affected, people at airports, people in front of their screens, they couldn't work. We're talking about multiple billions of dollars of losses, right? All from a vendor that 95% of the population, probably 99% of the population, had never heard of. So what this clearly shows, and it couldn't have been timed better for a DORA, is to say, look, organizations, you need to map your critical business processes to vendors, and then you need to make sure that those vendors are, managed and that the due diligence is done, and you kind of understand exactly where your vulnerabilities are with those vendors. So I think this is going to create a significant new cultural mindset towards resiliency and towards how you manage third and fourth party risk.
Yeah, and PJ, if I may, sorry, and Sajjad, I was sharing the story yesterday. I've been at the conference and asking, the early question, which I'm sure I was popular for, but the description given, I asked what happens in 12 months if there is a CrowdStrike event. What would the CBI expect from DORA? And I think the point you're making about your ship is also is a good analogy, because it's a fleet of ships. So the ships beside, and one of the bits of information that came out was actually in the preparation for DORA Go Live, the organizations that the European regulators have set up when CrowdStrike happened, they were able to share information in a fairly timely manner to understand the scope of the impact. So in a post-DORA world, you would hope that actually that effectiveness is growing, and those groups are in place to respond to that.
Yeah, and I think this ties nicely to another point, which is the cost of being 100% ship shape is infinite. Just like we could always chase the zero risk curve and never get on the ship in the first place, because then that would be the safest ship ever. We can't really ever have a ship that is really 100% compliant with operational resilience. So, I guess Sajjad, coming back to you, what do you have to do differently in this environment to help mitigate that?
Well, like you said, I think the bar on resiliency is never ending, right? You can always be more resilient. I think what most organizations need to realize is that what's happened over the last 25 years is just things that probably everyone had on some kind of tail risk thing, whether it's global pandemics, global financial crisis, wars, you're talking about huge weather events across the globe. So the global risks are being magnified because we are so interconnected. So you've got to start thinking of resiliency not as an overhead, but I think as almost like the cost of doing business. But also, more importantly, if you invest in it, you're going to have a competitive advantage over your competitors, because fundamentally, a lot of people are going to view DORA as a check box exercise, right? Which is a mistake, right? As I jokingly said, does DORA stand for Digital Operational Resilience Act, or is it defend our rear
access?
Yes, access. Sorry, I was looking for an alternative word. Access is the right word, and it isn't about kind of just making sure you've done enough, because at the end of the day, if you were one of those vendors that got impacted by CrowdStrike, your reputational risk has just gone through the floor. You've lost business, you've lost customer support. It's a significant part. So resiliency and third-party management and understanding those critical processes is not just a nice to have anymore in this really, really interconnected world. It is an absolute critical core competency of any board and any executives. So it's not like the chief risk officer has to be the resiliency person or the chief operating officer. This has got to be across the whole board. The CEO, the board, they've got to have a pretty much prime role in making sure that resiliency is embedded within the organization, and that they understand in terms of scenario planning what would happen if critical vendors suddenly became unviable.
And you can go further with that. You were talking about it being a competitive advantage, but you also might not be invited to play, right? If you're the weak spot and everyone knows it and knows you've underinvested, there's every risk that in the connected world, people start to say, no thanks, we'll not do business with you.
Exactly.
And let's not forget that the arbiters of what does good look like, and the ones that will be telling everybody there are challenges, will also have different views themselves. So this week, the head of DORA enforcement has been appointed by the ESAs, and that individual is French and has come out of the French system. So they will be taking their view, but it could be different from Germany and from Spain and from all the other countries, including Ireland. So, Chris, your point about what the Irish regulator has to say, because they have the SEER regime and nobody else does, will be factored into the mix. And I think it makes this regulatory arbitrage point very sticky.
Yeah, no, fair.
So let's come on to then how does technology help? Because these are technology problems. We must be able to use technology, right, Sajjad?
Yeah. Well, I absolutely believe that without the use of technology, organizations are going to struggle to comply, because to your point, you're talking about thousands and thousands of paragraphs, huge. I mean, DORA compared to the UK framework is a lot more prescriptive. We know it encompasses a wider set of institutions. So without the use of technology, and I think it's going to be really, really difficult. So if you're going to try and do this within your existing compliance kind of operating model, I think you're going to really struggle to kind of meet this. And I think technology can be used in kind of four areas. One is in kind of data mapping and the whole kind of mapping of your business processes and understanding which vendors are kind of instrumental in those critical business processes. So, for example, take the CrowdStrike example again. If security patching was a business process, I think you would understand exactly how security patching is done. The advantages and disadvantages of doing automated versus semi-automated, and that might have highlighted that there was a concentration risk, or there was a problem in the sense that those patching was going straight to your production servers. The second area I would say is effectively compliance automation. So how are you demonstrating to your executives and to your board that you're actually meeting DORA requirements? Doing that manually just would fill me with horror in terms of just the amount of mistakes and the amount of time that will take. The third use case I could see, something like AI helping with is all your contract changes. So you've got kind of two choices when it comes to third-party contracts, right? You can either go clause by clause and do that manually, or I think what probably most sensible organizations will end up doing is adding a DORA addendum. And again, you probably need a lawyer, PJ, to kind of explain, but effectively that addendum then supersedes the main agreement in terms of anything that conflicts. So effectively, but again, you're going to need to use AI to kind of help you with, if you're going to do the former, to help you with those relevant clauses. And effectively, I think the final thing is in terms of third-party management. One of the challenges that DORA is going to bring is, how do you bring real-time information into your ongoing management? So vendor A suddenly has a scandal amongst its CEO or C-suite. There's a weather event that makes it, some of their critical services and products go offline. They suddenly have a financial, issue in terms of, the ratings agencies. Some of that information, if you are only getting that kind of haphazard or in a semi-unstructured way, that's not going to really meet the requirements of DORA going forward, especially if they're a critical vendor. So how do you build that into, say, if most organizations are going to have quarterly reviews of vendors and to make sure, how do you build that kind of real-time information about that vendor into those governance calls? So I think those are kind of at least four uses of technology, probably a lot more, but obviously I'll stop there.
Chris.
Yeah, I think there's some really good examples in there. I definitely think the new vendors or the fintechs going into large organizations, I worry the threshold rises to the point where that's prohibitive. So I can see that being a risk, and likely ironic that some of those fintechs can solve some of the issues but can't get through the door because of the complexity and the threshold of procurement or the enhanced importance placed on the procurement stage. They're ultimately going to have to protect the organization. Completely fair, but there'll be organizations that are transformational in terms of what they're bringing to market, but perceived as risky because they are, sub 5 years and things like that. So, whilst tech will solve it, I think is the right argument, there is the unintended consequence of DORA, or the risk of unintended consequences there. I think the visualization of risk, so visualization of data points and concentration either internally within organizations, so clusters of systems that are connected, that maybe people believe that they weren't connected anymore or weren't quite as important as they said, will become potentially more apparent if the visualization is used. I also think tools that show visualization of third parties, particularly once you start doing it across multiple firms, and you realize the kind of peer risk will be quite prevalent as well.
That's really interesting. Both you guys have come at it from different directions, but I think, Sajjad, you spoke about a DORA addendum, and Chris, you talked about the internal versus external. At the end of the day, this has to be the ecosystem coming to grips with the way business is done and what does risk look like. And ultimately, I think that's a whole new level of standards for the individually by market. Would you agree?
Yes, I would agree with that. You then get into Europe and UK. So we talked very much DORA here, but UK similarities and what that means for doing business here versus other parts of the world. Maybe that's a RegCast in itself.
Yeah, Chris, that's a great point. When I look at the analysis, which we just published on our website, I mean, ultimately, if I'm a vendor to the UK and Europe, I need to be European compliant. So really, it's those standards on incident management or the contractual clauses that really will start to matter more. And it probably really, over time, will become just the standard globally, that we still need to look at the US and where they're going. But I guess, Sajjad, coming back to your point about deployment of technology, you're the AI expert here. You have the degree. Can you see AI helping to investigate whether the use of AI trips the definition for the EU AI Act of high risk and then documents it for the regulator?
Yeah, I mean, there's a level of irony in that question, but ultimately, yes, because the EU AI Act, as you know, regulates use cases rather than the technology itself. So depending on how AI is used in those use cases, obviously organizations have a high bar of governance and they have to demonstrate, conformity, and, they have to have documentation and they have to do rigorous testing and whatever. And, whether it's the use of AI tools to report that or AI tools to kind of monitor that. I mean, you can now, if you take most organizations have, tons of documentation all over the place, right? And, you can now have AI tools that can kind of download the EU AI Act or download 22,000 paragraphs of DORA and then effectively use that to compare your existing policies and procedures to see, which ones are being flagged, right? And which ones are going to come under the scope of regulation. So I think, like I said, this isn't, when we say you need to invest in compliance and technology, this is not going out and hiring 100 extra people in compliance. You could, and I think you will need some extra people in compliance, but fundamentally the way you square this circle is you invest in technology that helps you kind of address this problem. But that's not going to help if the mindset at the top and the culture of the organization is let's do the minimum, let's just see what we can get away with, because fundamentally then that kind of ends up defeating the objective.
Absolutely. Chris, are you seeing that mindset of we're just going to tick the minimum boxes?
Not seeing it as prevalent as you could maybe argue for other regs and reg go lives. I think DORA has been, well publicized, the requirements, well drilled. In terms of readiness, you're seeing the, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of two different, so either ready and ahead of it or playing catch up. But maybe not quite the laissez-faire attitude towards compliance.
I think the other thing, PJ, is that it's just the volume of regulation that organisations have to meet. It's not just DORA, is it? I mean, if it was just DORA, it would be great. It's EU AI Act. It's
Micah,
refit.
It's there's everything going on.
AML stuff. I mean, I'm going to be in Frankfurt next week attending one of those workshops around data sharing. I think you mentioned it, Chris, that data sharing is absolutely a critical part, whether it's public to public or public to private, in terms of helping expand intelligence. But one of the constraints that we have is, whether it's, data governance and data privacy, in some cases GDPR, but in other cases, it feels like companies are reluctant because there might be a sense of collusion going on almost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Competition. So there's lots of reasons not to data collaborate amongst organizations. And without that collaboration, that's the other missing piece here, because, intelligence is really, really key. And I think in terms of vendor A or vendor B, so I think those two are added fuse. It's just the volume of regulation that organizations are having to deal with at the same time. And a lot of that's coming from the EU, right? And secondly, it's the inability or the reluctance or the cultural barriers, legal barriers in some cases, to actually collaborate.
Yeah, and certainly we've seen that pattern for the past 2 decades where, there's an initial rush for go live, everyone waits for day one expectations, and then they get going. And my sense is actually this latest rush at the end in Q4 has led to a lot of awakening that there are some real possibilities for collaboration and deployment of technology, not least from technology savvy suppliers of services, right? So the service providers themselves are realizing, like the lawyers that we heard about in episode 1, we can come in and offer a repeatable service that allows you to have advice via using some of this technology ourselves. So those shifts are happening in the market. The vendors are coming to realize what this will actually mean, as well as the firms. And I think we'll be looking at a really fun ride for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was an interesting point from yesterday. And again, going back to the question I asked the CBI and what good would look like, in 12 months. And I think your point around the rush now ties into what they would expect. So that ability to show that you have a plan for DORA compliance, you are meeting key requirements, and where you are improving through them, you have a plan to improve through them. They were discussing very much outcome-based measures of success, and the time to get back up, the timing of reports would be, I suppose, for being blunt, the knowing you've been impacted, as well, would be key elements that firms need to have in their plan to address that. So I would agree, fun ride, but probably really only gets it going rather than potentially coming to an end or a pause.
I love it. We got all the way to the port. Sajjad, your final comment for this analogy and to wrap us up.
Well, look, I mean, if you believe the CEO of Delta Airlines, the CrowdStrike outage cost his company $1.5 billion. I don't know how much the DORA programs are costing. I wouldn't think that's a fraction of that, and that's just one vendor. So. Yeah. What we're seeing in a global interconnected world is that really the cost of not doing this is going to far exceed the cost of actually doing it properly. And if we can kind of just make that very, very clear in terms of the C-suite and the boardrooms, I think that would be a major, major win for DORA, because I think it's not about, spreadsheets, right? It's not about, compliance boxes. It's really about, how do you make resiliency a core part of your DNA? It's really about competitive advantage because you want to be the most robust player out there. It's fundamentally about strengthening and understanding your third-party relationships, because that will not just improve resiliency, but that can also improve other opportunities for your organization.
At the end of the day, the cost of collaboration isn't low. There's a lot of inherent friction in trying to bring those fleets together. But if we do manage to bring them together, we can really lower the cost base for all of this change. And by the time we pile up a DORA on a PS21.3 in the UK and then throw on an EU AI Act, we've already spent more than a MiFID, right?
Yeah,
these costs are extremely high. There's tens of thousands of actors. The best thing we can do next year is get ourselves organized and start communicating and being on the front foot for these conversations. So I very much thank you guys for your participation today. Could help get the word out. We're going to continue this series. We're also continuing to publish on our website. You'll be able to find all it on the link below the show notes. But we just published the EU versus UK OpRes analysis, Ready, Set, Resilient. It followed winning the OpRes Marathon and taming the DORA Dragon. You can find all those in the newsletter too, which has gone out on LinkedIn, which we'll open the show notes. But thank you very much for your participation, and I look forward to catching up again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. And if you've enjoyed the content, please like us so more people can join the conversation. Download all our episodes via all the major platforms. Come to the JWG website, which is jwg-it.eu, and follow our LinkedIn groups.